Hello and welcome to the lesson on sexual morality. First off, we're not here to teach you how to be more moral when it comes to this sort of thing, as interesting as the subject can be. And we're not actually looking to resolve any kind of difficult sexual moral problem, at least not the outset here. Rather, our goal with this little section of a course is a little more specific. We're going to look at two readings. Our Sexual Ethics by Bertrand Russell, and Sexual Morality and the Concept of Using Another Person by Thomas Mapps. We're going to analyze these two readings a bit. We're going to compare them with an eye towards introducing ourselves to two very fundamental philosophical principles of morality that are going to rear their heads throughout the course. And what better subject then to bring these principles up? We'll get started with Bertrand Russell. Now, I don't always say much about the personalities behind the material that we read, but I think it's worth taking a moment to talk a bit about Bertrand Russell, who was widely regarded as one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. He was a British philosopher, but also a mathematician, author, peace activist, and so on. He lived a very long life and accomplished so many things. He wrote on a vast range of cultural matters, including the matter we're about to discuss. But it would be important to put this in perspective. Living in the early 20th century in late Victorian England, he was surrounded by a morality, by a culture very different from our own. But he did have a sense of perspective that allowed him to step out of that and challenge prevailing views. In fact, he challenged many prevailing social and cultural traditions, and in the process, he angered a lot of people. And the reading, Our Sexual Morality, which hopefully you've read by now, in fact, did anger a lot of people when it was written. So, Bertrand Russell's main claim in the essay, which you may have gathered, is that we need a new sexual morality. And by we, he doesn't mean us, he means them, the society of Victorian England in which he lived. Why do we need a new sexual morality? Well, he says that his people are caught between conflicting impulses, polygamy, which we could say essentially is a desire for multiple sexual partners, and jealousy. We desire this sort of thing, but we actually get jealous of others, he says, those partners of ours, when they only desire what we desire. The remedy for this, as he sees it, and we'll get into later on a little more about why this poses a problem. The remedy for this is a new system of values. A new principle that would replace the old one, which is, you might say, essentially based on the principle of monogamy. Now, this principle of monogamy, a principle where the proper form, the proper sexual practice is sort of being with one partner, staying with one partner. But this is conditioned by two values, as he sees it. Those two values are jealousy and modesty. Now, Bertrand Russell tells us that these values might have had some use in the past. Perhaps they were the glue that held more primitive societies together at a time where people might kill each other over jealousy, for instance. But that's to say that they are primitive impulses in the sense that they were necessary for more primitive kinds of social arrangements. But as enlightened people at the dawn of the 20th century, Russell argues, we ought to be free of them. Be free to follow the pursuit of more worthwhile values. What is this worthwhile value? Well, consider what might have been the problem with this traditional sexual morality in the first place. Why are people dissatisfied with it? On his view, it's making people unhappy. And maybe there's something to be made of that. Here's an important way to think about what Russell is talking about here. Now, it's true that most of us probably have some sense of modesty, and many of us have some sense of jealousy. We're capable of feeling jealous, sometimes intensely jealous. The question might be, does it have to be that way? Is it built into us to have overwhelming feelings of modesty or overwhelming feelings of jealousy? Say when we see somebody we care about, somebody we desire, with someone else. Russell suggests that the answer is no, that in fact, many of our moral belief systems and many of our feelings about sexual morality in particular might be based on convention, rules that we've made for ourselves. These moral feelings might be based on rules that could be changed. So here's an example, and it's not Russell's example, and it doesn't have much to do with sexual morality or really anything to do with it, but this might be a helpful way of illustrating this. Consider that a person will feel violated when his property is stolen. A stranger takes something of yours without asking. That's going to sting. However, you only have this reaction because we have rules about private property. If we didn't have such rules, such that you couldn't own a thing in the first place, you wouldn't feel violated when a person took that thing. That's his approach. So if we went without a system of property, feelings of ownership and everything that goes along with that would go away. How does this relate to Russell's views on sexual morality? Well, one way of looking at it is that you expect exclusivity in a relationship because that's part of the rules. Marriage, for instance, is understood to entail monogamy. And Russell thinks that it's for that reason that we feel especially jealous when we see our partner with someone else. But if we didn't have that understanding in the first place, if we didn't have that expectation of monogamy, if we didn't have that rule, then we wouldn't feel intense jealousy when we didn't have a strictly monogamous relationship. Now, again, we are representing this as Russell's view. This is not my view necessarily, and as we study this, we're certainly not trying to talk you into this. We're simply trying to understand where he's coming from because it seems to get at an important moral principle, which we'll reach soon. So, as an alternative, since the conventional Victorian sexual morality tends to make many people so unhappy, we ought to rethink it all. And if what's driving us to rethink it all is that we're so unhappy, maybe there is something to this principle of happiness. In fact, he would envision a whole new system of sexual morality, a whole new set of rules determining what sorts of activities, practices, behaviors are right and wrong. And happiness would be the ultimate criteria of that, not these more primitive values as he describes them, like jealousy and modesty. That's no basis for a system around which we organize most of our adult lives. Now, the important thing, another important thing really, is that this approach to morality, and well, I'll have to leave it to you for now to consider what this entails, what actually would be considered right and wrong in this new morality if you consider that it is based on happiness. The important takeaway for now, because this will really set the scene for a lot of what we discuss later in the course, is that this makes Bertrand Russell what we call a utilitarian. Now, a utilitarian is a person who believes in the principle of, you might guess, utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is a principle that holds, and we'll explore it in much more detail down the road, but it holds that the morally right action or practice or rule is the one that tends to promote the most happiness. Maybe that's oversimplifying it a bit, but that's where we'll leave it for now, because in this one discussion of sexual morality, we bring to the surface a whole perspective on what makes certain things moral, what makes certain other things immoral. So remember this term. It's going to be very important for us throughout the course. And we're going to move away from it to introduce another perspective, a conflicting perspective that also will rear its head quite a bit as we move on. Now we're going to consider a different take on sexual morality. Thomas Mapps, the author of your other assigned reading, Sexual Morality and the Concept of Using Another Person, emphasizes the importance of certain obligations in sexual morality. And we'll explore that idea. First, we want to make clear that even though this individual, this philosopher, Thomas Mapps, has a different outlook on sexual morality than Bertrand Russell, that does not mean that they are going to disagree all the time, or even very much, when it comes to deciding which sorts of actions are morally right and which are morally wrong. It could be that Bertrand Russell and Thomas Mapps agree that polygamy is not such a bad thing. They might agree that we're not always obligated to be monogamous, but it's likely that they would do so for different reasons, and we'll see why. For Mapps, our primary obligation, as you might have gathered from the reading, is that we ought to always avoid certain ways of using other people. And in a moment, we'll talk about what that entails. But the important thing to consider now is that the way he sees it, certain actions are simply inherently wrong. It doesn't really matter the degree to which a certain action or a certain practice would tend to make people happier in total or tend to make people unhappy. As he sees it, it's either irrelevant or it's secondary. There are certain ways of going about sexual activity that are just wrong no matter what our motivations are, no matter what comes of it. How do we use other people then? What is it that we ought to avoid doing in order to avoid using other people? Well, one thing Mapps tells us is that we ought to avoid coercing other people. And first off, what we're about to discuss might very well provide a philosophical basis for explaining why it is morally wrong to rape another person. What's wrong about rape, as far as Mapps is concerned, it's not just the fact that it causes suffering, humiliation, and so on. It's not just that it's a terrible thing for the victim. I mean, of course that matters, but at the bottom of it, what makes it inherently wrong is that it is coercive, and it is degrading to another person in that the rapist uses another person for his own pleasure, coerces. Now, in a case of a current coercion would be just that, when someone commits rape by the use of force. There's also what we might call dispositional coercion. So consider this little puzzle. A person doesn't force himself or herself upon another person, but makes a threat, holds a gun to the person's head, have sex with me or I will shoot you. Now, some have argued that in that case, when the person agrees to have sex in order to not get shot, they are consenting. Now, from one point of view, that might be true. The person is willingly make the decision to meet this demand. But we do have to consider that the sort of coercion at play, the threat, undermines the voluntariness of the consent. In some real sense, the person agreed to sex, but they had no choice. And so we call this dispositional coercion. And that's something else that Thomas Mapps would regard as rape as we described it, or, well, really, it's another instance of using another person. That is to say, clearly, dispositional coercion, along with a current coercion, is one way of using another person. But there's a whole other category. We can use people not just with the use of force, or the threat of force, but through deceit, through lies or trickery, one can get others to consent to sexual relations, but the consent is not really voluntary. It's not true consent, it's argued, if the person doesn't actually know what they're consenting to. So, to take an extreme example, somebody pretends to be someone else. Someone puts on a disguise. A master of disguise pretends to be someone's spouse and fools that spouse into having sex with them. It might seem far-fetched, but that will work for us as an example in these circumstances. That is a case of deceit. Why? Well, as the author explains, consent is not voluntary unless it is informed consent. Yes, the one person was agreeing to have sex with another person, but only because they were laboring under a falsehood brought about through the deceit. So when you get someone to do something for you, like have sex, without their voluntary consent, according to MAPS, you are using them, and that is morally wrong. So, putting this on perspective, it's a safe bet that both Bertrand Russell and Thomas MAPS would agree that rape is morally wrong, probably in any conceivable set of circumstances. But why they believe rape is wrong differs. And that's why we're considering this example now to lay the groundwork and to help us to understand that there are different perspectives on morality that sometimes lead us to the same conclusions, sometimes to different conclusions. Russell would most likely understand the wrongfulness of rape lying in the fact that it causes so much suffering. If the purpose of a good sexual morality is to promote happiness, then any action that really runs counter to that, like rape, which causes great suffering, would be immoral. Thomas MAPS, again, sees it differently. Really, the fundamental thing that makes rape morally wrong is that it involves using another person. In this case, through coercion. But there are instances, arguably, where someone could commit rape through deceit, possibly in the example involving a disguise, as we discussed. So there we have it, an introduction to two very important perspectives that we'll be revisiting in the course very soon. Thank you.